some lively personalities, and I know that they are going to lead some awesome Q&A. So expect this session to be pretty interactive. Because we are starting a few minutes later, I will not read all of their bios off for you, and I think they'll thank me for that. But yeah, take it away, guys.
All right, thanks.
Wow, okay, that's like the super brief introduction. So let's start with this. My name is Joshua. I'm an architect. I'm principal at Lord Sargent in Atlanta. And Jimmy, you want to
Jimmy Mitchell with Skanska. We're the contractor at the Kenda building, among other things.
Shan, Arora, I'm the director of the Kenda building. Not an architect, not a builder, actually a lawyer. So if I don't understand something, I just say magic.
He says that a lot when I talk. So we're going to talk, I guess we've got two parts here. So we've got the first hour or so right now, and we'll give a little bit of a explanation, background, virtual tour, and we'll try to save some time, more than 5 minutes, for questions, and we can have some dialogue right now. And then we'll do a lessons learned, I think, in the next session for the second hour, and we'll definitely make that very audience-driven, and we'll have some video, or sorry, not video, but photo stuff to back it up, but we can be pretty spontaneous and respond to folks' interests. But there's the three of us. You'll probably learn something. I hope you learn a lot. It may not be these things. Want to make sure whenever anyone talks about any regenerative building, particularly a living building, it takes a village, to steal Shan's phrase, to create these types of projects, right? It's important to me that my entire team's logos are up here. This is only like the tip of the iceberg of the people that were involved. You heard Mark speaking before. Mark was integral to the project. One of the last sessions I was in talked about Andrew Pogon, who was also integral to this project, and the Phipps Conservatory. So it takes a lot of us. It's a collaborative act. There is no one genius sitting in the back, in spite of what Ayn Rand may have you believe if you've read The Fountainhead. And if you have, I apologize in advance. Want to think about any kind of building, any act in the built environment. You can start to see that through a number of different lenses. And for this particular one, I want to introduce a specific concept. Mark talked about thinking about their building at lunch, the PAE Living Building, as a 500-year building and thinking about longevity. I want to offer the idea of long-termism. Sorry, that better? Okay, sorry. Want to talk about long-termism for a second. This is an idea about empathy on one hand and making sure that we put ourselves in other people's shoes. It's also about thinking long-term, and I don't mean on even human timescales. I mean a much, much longer term. This is an idea that came from an Oxford professor, a forthcoming book about the idea in which you imagine, as a thought exercise for a second, that you live every life that any human has ever lived in the history of humanity. And you live them sequentially, one at a time. And you do that. Humans have been on Earth for about 300,000 years. Most mammalian species will be on Earth, on average, before natural extinction, let's set global warming aside, for about 1 million years. So if you lived every individual life that has ever been, and then you lived every individual life that has yet to be in the terms of humankind, what you would find relative to a single human life is that humanity right now is a couple months old. There are way more people in the future than there have ever been in the past. Way more lives to be lived. And so when we think and we act and we build the built environment, we need to think through that lens. We need to understand the impact that we have on future generations in that way. And with that, the Living Building Challenge is a fantastic tool to help us get there. The Living Building Challenge, as Mark noted quickly, is about living within the means of the place in which you are building. That means culturally, it means energy-wise, it means water-wise, it means ecologically. Everything you do, you want to live within the constraints of your site and of your climate. Mark talked also about this briefly. Living Building Challenge is divided into petals. Each of those petals is made up of imperatives. The great thing about the Living Building Challenge, this is not to knock LEED, but none of this is optional. You have to do everything. You cannot say, oh, well, I'm really going to focus on water on this project, but I'm going to leave energy because that's less important to me, right? That doesn't work. We have to think holistically. We have to act holistically. The Living Building Challenge, though, does, of course, have different tiers. We have full certification, and the newest version, version 4, now also has pedal certification and core certification. I think if you wanted to ask me to make a comparison, you could make an argument that core certification is somewhere approximating LEED Platinum, roughly speaking. But it's also a slightly more holistic, more mandatory things you have to do. Can't not do any one of them, so it's a little bit more interesting. But all these programs have in common the idea that you have to build the building and then run it for a full year, fully occupied, before you can be certified. And that's really important. We're not talking about hypothetical design models. We're talking about actual real-world performance. So to focus on the Kenda building for a second here, the Kenda building was implemented by a grant from, any guesses? The Kenda Fund, right? And so the idea behind the Kenda Fund was the goal was not to build a building. The goal was to change the world. Now, this seems slightly ambitious and maybe slightly cocky, but the idea was to use the building as a change mechanism to evolve design, construction, and these thoughts in the southeastern United States and maybe even beyond. So what that means is that within the Living Building Challenge system, we have net positive energy, net positive water, all these other goals that are a part of that system become mandatory for the project. It definitely helped the village of teammates that I referenced before come to terms with this because this was known from the very beginning. Before our team was even on the project, this was a mandatory goal for the project. It was non-negotiable. That is something that becomes really important. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The project, for those of you not familiar with it, it's about 37,000 square feet. It's a general use education building on Georgia Tech's campus. It's at the core of campus. I'll show it in a second. The project was funded 100% by a grant from the Kenda Fund. And it's important to understand the political climate in which this gift was given. It was done at a time right after the Georgia legislature actually said it was illegal to spend money, state funds, on a state building to certify using any third-party certification system, read LEED, that used wood selection as a part of its mandatory criteria. Now, yeah, let's not dwell on that because that's a subject of a whole different hour-long discussion that will probably get me in trouble. But at the end of the day, what it means is this was only possible because the building was completely funded by a private funder. And I believe Georgia Tech actually secured permission in advance of the fund actually being granted before that law was actually cemented, so it was all good. So the site here is in the middle of the campus. Does this have a laser? Yeah. This is our footprint. When we started working on the building, actually Tech told us we could build anywhere in this 8-acre zone that we wanted to, and we landed where it is now for a laundry list of reasons that has to do with relationship to the primary vehicular entrance on the master plan on the eastern edge, the building across the street that's kind of loud, but the opportunity that this space presents as a large open green space within the campus and how we could connect to that and use that to connect people to nature and to the site and to the city of Atlanta. So within this, you start to see where that is in the campus, right? Georgia Tech's is an urban campus if you're not familiar with it. Every project on Tech's campus is thought of as having a 400-acre site. That is effectively the entire campus, so we do want to think about how this impacts everybody else on the campus and how all these pieces tie together. And this is where we are in the city of Atlanta. You'll notice the funny squiggly purple line. That funny squiggly purple line is actually the Eastern Continental Divide, which runs right through the city of Atlanta, runs right through the state of Georgia. And here we have the entire continental United States. What is important here is to understand your locality and understand its relationship in context to everything else around you. So when you start to think about, in this example, water, and where does water go, right? We're actually really high in the watershed because we're right next to the continental divide. Well, as Jose, my friend from Anthropogon, likes to say, with position in the landscape comes great responsibility. So every drop of water that leaves our site becomes potentially polluting and flooding somewhere else downstream. Really important that we start to think in that way. And so then that leads us to site solutions like this on the site in the middle of the campus that have 1, gray water treatment at the front door for educational purposes, and 2, comprehensive on-site water treatment. The site was designed based on the Living Building Challenge criteria that only 10% max of water from a 10-year storm could leave the site, and that mimics the ecological condition. However, our site is massively outperforming that. It's very hard to measure the intensity of a storm and say, oh, that was a 500-year storm or that was a 100-year storm. But the way the system works on the site, if anyone has more questions, we can elaborate on how the stormwater system works. But this has resulted in no water leaving the site, including rain events that were at least 100 years and potentially more. And so this is functioning well above expectations in terms of preventing flooding downstream. With that, Shan's going to lead us through a virtual tour.
Yeah, so we have 2 virtual tours. It's the same content visually. One lives on our website. It's a Matterport interface, so you can click on hot buttons and it'll pop up pictures, videos. But the way that I have a thespian voice, it typically.
Okay, no
Can
worries.
everyone hear me? Fantastic. You'll be seeing the back of my. You'll see the back because I'm going to be showing you the same exact thing except through Google Street View. So this is live on Google Street View. If you type in Kenda building in Google Maps and take a little yellow guy, drop them in, and boom, there you are. So for the next 15 minutes, we're going to do a quick tour of some features and interesting things, but then we're going to open it up to just straight up conversation. So do you mind if I sit? All right. So, okay. You know how it's weird that when you are on someone else's computer, suddenly you've never used a computer before. So this is the current virtual tour.
Well, hello, Shan.
Hey, how's it going, y'all? We actually have version 2.0 is going to go live soon. It's cheeky fun. All right, so water, place and water, equity. Equity is one of the 7 petals. This has been something that we have kind of stumbled across collectively, that water is so integral wherever you are in a place. The hydrology of that place is vital. The relationship with water for the ecosystem is vital. So what we have created is a forest in the middle of the city, because the P
Yeah, Sean, you mentioned equity, and Atlanta deals with this in a huge way around like our stadium project, where the creation of these downtown spaces then have stormwater issues, and then those communities in that area, they're blighted in large part because of the poor stormwater management, and it floods, and then of course you can't get insurance because it floods, and so.
No, I was like, so while we're looking at the western side of this building, most people who are in the green design industry would be quick to point out that our building may face the wrong way, that ideal orientation would have a north-south focus, minimizing the east and west facades. But as I noted on the site plan, it was really important to us to connect to this larger green space. And so this is part of how we do it with this facade. And you'll see when we get inside the building, it's very porous out to the west. So we're connecting the site and the building and trying to break down those barriers. You'll also notice we affectionately refer to this as the regenerative porch. Everything that you're looking at here does at least 2 or 3 different things for us in terms of the living building challenge, in terms of building performance, in terms of human comfort. So you're looking at the photovoltaic panels, which generate electricity primarily. Their secondary job is collecting water and pushing it back, as Shan was referring to. Their third job is as a shading device for that facade, and they come out quite a distance, and that's really important to make sure that we get adequate shading on that western facade. They also happen to create a de facto roof over a porch, which then creates a social space, which creates a gathering space, which allows program inside the building to actually spill outside into a sheltered condition.
If you let me, I'd like to, I was fortunate enough to be a part of the integrated team and involve all the design meetings as well as the construction side. When, the Living Building Challenge of the 20 imperatives, when these decisions are made of what to do, they're going to positively impact many of the imperatives, but then they're also going to negatively impact many of the imperatives. And the design, the choices that went out are the ones that, like Joshua said, end up having positive things for 6, 7, 8, 10 of these imperatives. And it's interesting, the team came to the conclusion on the gutters and the PV array because there was another addition of a green roof. Earlier in the design, we decided to have that green roof with the walkout space, and that it's an amazing space that Sean's going to, but one of the negative impacts that it created was we were not going to collect our potable water from now this newly created green roof. So we lost about 5,000. We lost about 5,000 square feet of water collection area, and we had to make it up somehow. And that was when, oh wow, we have over 6,000 square feet of solar panels overhanging the building. Why not just gutter it and bring it to the high roof to make up for the lost area that the green roof created? So though the green roof, of course, is an amazing sustainability element, it actually had a negative impact on the water collection area.
But yeah, I mean, that's essentially the crux of it. So this is tied back to some of the things that we've heard this morning. We heard about passive house, passive design by a friend from the UK. This is passive design. We have a building facing west. We looked at the architecture of our region before air conditioning and said, what is a passive non-mechanical solution
Yeah, well, so I'll just the mechanical system here. This is basically what keeps the air fresh in the building. So the primary intended way for heating and cooling, as Mark had mentioned earlier, is an irradiant flooring. Then what allows us to really expand that thermal comfort is we have 62 ceiling fans in the building. So the way you kind of locally control the air is by turning on or off the ceiling fans or increasing the speed of the ceiling fans. And then the problem there would be if you don't actually ventilate with outside air, you have the risk of having like sick building syndrome. And so the DOAS unit, the dedicated outdoor air system, circulates the air. Now that system works like a regular air handling unit, but it has a energy recovery wheel in it as well, where we of course exchange the humidity from the outside into the to the exhausted air. And so that's actually why we have ductwork in the building, is because we're trying to circulate about 20% of the air, and it keeps it fresh. And I have to say, the Georgia Tech standard was to not compromise on comfort, and it was a bit of a concern, but it is the most comfortable building. The den-bound temperature is wider there, but essentially what happens in the summertime, if it's 95 degrees outside, you're not walking into a cold building, right? You're walking into a building that's cooler and has some air movement in it, and it just feels great. Yes.
Fire.
I routinely ask colleagues when they bother to come to the building, but mostly folks from outside. If you have your set point in the summer at 78 degrees, how long before the occupants riot? And they're like pretty instant. Our set point is 78 degrees. In the lessons learned, we're going to talk about how COVID accidentally introduced us to an alternative, perhaps, to radiant flooring, and COVID presented opportunities to really test out what we had developed. But the final kicker is this 330 kilowatt solar array that we knew was over-designed, but oversized, and we knew that the building was over-engineered. We could not have expected the electricity performance and net positive energy performance of the building to be what it was. 105% is the goal. You can't do it in hot, swampy South with the party line. We knew that we would do it because we engineered it to be done. I have curiosity, what did you think the building would hit? I never asked you that. What did you think in your...
I thought it'd be about 150, 160%.
I wasn't that optimistic. I was thinking we'd be in the 120 range.
All right. So we're over 200%.
240 actually.
Yeah, I think.
The first year was 240. The second year was 201. We expect it to be even less, but not because of a degradation in performance. It's that as the director, I'm thinking, let's throw more programming into the building to take advantage of the fact that we're net positive energy.
Yeah, and you're the director, so you know this more than anybody. But in the fall and spring semesters, it's active. It's 1,000 to 1,200 students and people a day. So it's a used building.
And let's talk about that for a second. It is an extensively used building, and unlike an office building, which PAE's building is primarily an office building, it is exceedingly difficult for us to fully control how this building is going to be used. This auditorium straight ahead is a 176 person auditorium.
back on the mechanical system side, this one room is actually different than the rest of the building. It does not have radiant flooring. This and the bathrooms and the basement do not have radiant flooring. Everything else does. But it has the carpet tile in there, which helps acoustically. And then as Shan is showing here, it has its own air handling unit. And I think the building also benefits from that flexibility that it has this large room that has its own air handling unit that's more of a very typical system. And so, the building, they can open up those garage doors and take advantage of both the DOAS and this air handling unit.
Oh, hey, look, I made it. This is the roof. This is the roof. Ooh, pretty, awesome, nice, yeah. Lesson learned. The urban agriculture requirement, I was exceedingly skeptical that it would survive beyond the certification 12 months. But fortunately, our horticulturalist is super passionate, and we found an undergraduate student organization and a graduate student organization that committed to bring the volunteers needed to farm our rooftop, and then the horticulturalist is going to train them, teach them, guide them, and this has been phenomenal for health and happiness for the about 150 students that cycle through our rooftop for 2 plantings for harvest and then 1 planting to make sure that the topsoil doesn't erode during the winter. It has been A, exceedingly successful, and B, blown me away on how much food can be grown on 3/4 of this, because 1/4 is devoted to our honeybees. It's flowering plants for our honeybees. I'm
And I
gonna
will say,
speak about a few more things, and then we'll open it up. Joshua, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, when we're looking at the green roof here, because of the way the math works, which has changed in LBC 4.0, but LBC 3.1, which is what this is certified under, still had actually quite a robust urban ag requirement. And so that roof does not get us the full requirement, even though we're actually double counting most of it, because the honeybees are a part of the building program. There's a researcher in the building that studies urban honeybees, and food for people and food for other species can be double counted. So a pollinating plant, like a blueberry plant, and about half that roof is blueberries, can be counted once for feeding the bees and the second time for feeding the people. But even with that, we have edibles. Sorry, we're not in Colorado, so it's okay to say that.
Hey, what kind of stuff are we growing up on our roof?
No, Senator, I do not recall. So there are edible plant species elsewhere throughout the site, including used as a shading device on the auditorium, where we have muscadine grapes growing up the western facade, including where we have wintergreen and some other less common plants throughout the site, as well as fruiting trees throughout the site as well, all native-based species. So.
So, again, just to bring us up to speed of what we talked about, place, you gotta look at the ecology of the place, then you have to look at the hydrology of that site. I say, don't fight water. Water will always win. So work with water. Second thing, energy. Energy also begins with place. I mean, I like to say before air conditioning, if you
Yeah, this has been a fun opportunity for me to work with a design team and kind of take a leadership role in reusing, repurposing materials. So the challenge, the detail of the living building challenge is that for every 500 square meters of new design space, you incorporate one salvage material that gets repurposed new. What we ended up doing kind of on our own is we wanted the weight of the material that we threw away at the landfill at the end of the project to be less than the weight of the material that we actually took from the landfill that was being demolished somewhere else on the way to the landfill, but then repurposed it new again at Kenda. And we achieved that. It was about 57,000 pounds that we repurposed versus about 45,000 pounds that we threw away. So the minimum requirement was about 8 or 9. We worked together and we achieved 28 salvage materials. So these stairs are good examples. So that ADA ramp, which the team put right in the middle for wonderful reasons in terms of ADA accessibility, is material from the church. So the Eco Commons project, there used to be a police station that came down and moved to the corner. Formerly at that corner off 10th and Hemp Hill was a church that Georgia Tech owned. So that came down, and in the process we reclaimed some joist material from that church and made the ramp. One of the fun things about the stairs just to the left, there's these, as Joshua, as the team designed the building to have these 3 2-foot steps down along the western face of the building, so you'd be able to walk out to the landscape and into the Eco Commons Park. Those stairs look like butcher block. Well, what happened here is early on the programming of the building was right-sized, and the structural bays, the widths, landed at 10.5 feet. And that was very early in design, and so we let the team know that, as contractors, we're going to have to buy a 12-foot board to span 10.5 feet, and we're going to end up with like 10,000 pieces of 2x6 scrap. And so Joshua's team ran with that and ended up designing the way straight into the building, which was awesome. And so, in addition to that, we've got these bar tops and countertops throughout the building that are made from the Tree Save program. So storms will, every year or so, we end up with this beautiful oak tree that usually gets hit by a storm and comes down, and Georgia Tech saved those. We milled them, we dried them ourselves, and then kiln dried it. And after about a year and a half of processing, we ended up with our own material for some of our counters. Those stair treads are my favorite story as a Georgia Tech alum. So the first 2 buildings on Georgia Tech's campus were Tech Tower and another shop that ended up burning down. In 2016, Tech Tower was renovated, and they put in a new elevator shaft and fire stair. So there were a number of joists that were cut out from the original 1880s heart pine joists in the Tech Tower. Georgia Tech saved them, and we incorporated them as the stair treads on these monumental stairs, both from the basement to level 1 and level 1 to level 2. And one thing that's fun about this is a sustainability element. Too often we think that it costs more to do things that are more sustainable, and when we repurpose materials, it doesn't have to. In fact, in concert, we saved $84,000 on the budget by repurposing salvage materials. These stair treads were a big one. It was about 60,000 of the 84,000.
And then the last thing is, let me see if I can use the technical terms correctly. The nail laminated timber decking, which is what I call ceiling.
It's not a ceiling, Sean. It's decking.
But they are FSC certified wood from Alabama because we need to source 50% of all materials from within 1,000 kilometers. Do you understand? You're from the UK as well, or just 2 of you? Just one? Where's our friend from the UK? And she said 40 degrees Celsius, and I was just like,
That's hot.
it's about 600 something
You did.
And so it didn't have to be re-rated. And I think the question about incorporating salvage material into CLT, you might run into a re-rating type situation that,
Yeah, no one will do it.
yeah.
Yeah, you won't.
With NLT,
You won't find them.
you could do it if you do the design that we did.
Yeah.
I think in this case, since we did it, you might find them to do it. But when we went to bid to have the nails of 2x6s that were new nailed to a salvage 2x4, nailed to a new 2x6, and so on, we only received one qualified bid out of British Columbia, Canada, and it was 1.1 million, which was a budget buster for us. We ended up going to Home Depot and buying a few mock-up 2x6s and 2x4s. And it took me about 44 minutes to do a 5-foot by 12-foot panel on the floor at the Georgia Tech Grinnell warehouse. And then we interpolated that across the whole building and came to about $300,000 instead of 1.1 million. So doing it ourselves, we saved the project at $800,000 versus the low qualified bid.
And I love telling that story because, and there's only two more things we're going to talk about, which is Red List and then this little thing that I tell everybody. I did not know what the term value engineering was. I did not know what VE meant when I first came on board, and out of embarrassment, I refused to ask what VE meant. So I would just do a web search for VE, but I didn't know how to spell it. So finally, I turned to Jimmy one day and I'm like, what is VE? He goes, value engineering. I'm like, aha! But then I had something to look into. And it's also called vision elimination. Exactly. Exactly. So the more I looked at this term, value engineering, I realized you're engineering things that actually add value out of the project. Because sustainability is often engineered out of the project. And what I've told my colleagues at Georgia Tech, what I've told other people, is that after your project goes through value engineering, what you have left is what you're telling the world you value. And Joshua put up a slide at the very beginning. And we had a budget, it was $25 million. And it sounds like a lot of money, but in a corporate, in a collegiate setting, that can go quick. So we had a budget, and but we had two non-negotiable goals. Non-negotiable. It has to be a fully certified living building. It has to be a multidisciplinary classroom class time. So what they did is they said, does this add value? If it doesn't add value, it's out. And so then the only decision the design team was making is which one of these options gets us to our goal in the most value-oriented way, not whether you discard the goal. And that's something that is exceedingly important to remember. Whenever someone comes to me and says, what can we do to make sure that our project succeeds, is if you get all the stakeholders to say, what is the non-negotiable value of this project? And then there are ways to kind of bake that in and say that if you don't meet that goal, then there might be some penalty. We're going to just talk about Red List real quick, and the Red List is essentially 22 worst compressed chemicals and materials known to cause harm to human health and the natural environment, which for version 3.1 ends up being 777 chemical abstract numbers. It's some of the stuff that you've heard of, EPA, lead, asbestos, things you've never heard of. We had two FTE that essentially spent a lot of time vetting every permanent item, not shared, permanent item, against the Red List. Version 4.0 relaxes that a smidge to 90% by value, so you have a 10% get out of Red List jail free card. It's cumbersome. It's also important. It's moving the market to more Red List free materials that have what we have in our food. A nutrition label. Increasingly, materials have a declare label, a cradle label, environmental protection declarations that are given to people so they know what they're buying and putting into their buildings.
Hey, this is one thing I would like to say. If those of you who are involved in the past for low VOCs for lead, this is one too where like the learning curve, where Candida maybe pays for some of the upfront cost of, and then the future projects come along. Eventually, the red list material research and manufacturers, after a few years of going through this process, especially if all our buildings do this, any costs or burdens associated would go away because it would become a part of the regular process, like we have with LEED low VOCs. I remember when I first started about 20 years ago, a subcontractor would be like, low VOCs, add $50,000, I don't know why. And of course today you can get an app on your phone and just scan the barcode and it tells you all the VOCs, so it's no cost anymore. The same would be true, I think, eventually for this.
We should probably be quiet here and let everybody else ask us questions here. But one thing I just want to add on the red list, it's very easy to see it as a list of things you got to avoid, which it is. It's very easy to see it as a burden because it's a lot of time to get there. But just like everything else in holistic and regenerative design, it is interconnected with so many other things that we're trying to accomplish. And so I want to specifically point out the social and environmental justice aspects of the red list. So much of what the red list is actually saying should not be in the buildings is aimed, the tip of the iceberg are the building occupants. The next tier of folks that are impacted are people actually building and fabricating the building. The biggest impact is people who not just are manufacturing these things, but who are living in the communities that surround the factories that make these chemicals. And that is really the core, in my mind, of what the red list and where the red list and why the red list is so important.
Yeah, we could tell a story about every material in the building. You mentioned the fire protection system. It's red list free, except at the head of the sprinkler, there's a little Teflon. And the industry will not take that Teflon out, so we had to write a letter, a kind of a nasty letter, to 3 manufacturers of local sprinkler heads saying, hey, please make a Teflon-free alternative one day. But it's good for research because then it's, universities and institutions can see that list and say, there's some Teflon we need to get out of this sprinkler head. Oh, good point. So some institutions will not allow self-performing, right? And how we pull that off. On one hand, in this case, it was solving the problem, and Candida was a little bit different. We kind of like the Georgia Tech Yellow Book standard was thrown out a little bit. So we did not approach the job self-performing. We ended up doing it to solve the problem, and so they were ecstatic about that.
Yeah, I think the demonstration that there was only one competitive bid and it was outside the budget was enough to convince Georgia Tech that it was okay for Skanska to self-perform it.
Yeah.
Was that a product that was being funded by Kenda, or do you think you could have done that under the conventional state contract?
I think we could have gotten away with it under the state conventional guidelines, but it would have required a lot more documentation. Normally, every exemption in Georgia requires a separate, specific request for that product to not have to be procured in a non-traditional way, meaning not 3-part competitive spec, right? And so for Candida, we basically had, best way to characterize it would be a blanket approval letter subject to the project manager telling us it was okay. And so so we didn't have to write a letter for every single thing, or it would have eaten us alive.
I have to say, in the pre-con phase, because it's a single issue, a single source issue, the battle in pre-con was actually ensuring we had competition. And it was really hard to do at times. Like when we started for curtain wall, for example, the triple pane, there was only Schuco that was a supplier. Well, by the end, we worked with Alcoa and Conair had a product. So, we were able to get 2 bids. But you got to get 3 bids, right? So we dealt with that constantly on this project, which is getting better for the future because now you have multiple bidders before we started it.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was by sheer coincidence last week. I was on a call with a professor who has a lot of involvement in this building, and he actually pointed out during the discussion that it was one of the best acoustically performing buildings on campus. And so the rationale behind it at the architectural level, let's make this clear, not the acoustician's level, because that's not me, I'm just an architect, but flat, hard, reflective floor, acoustically speaking, right? We have avoided sound slap, right, which is two parallel hard surfaces where sound waves can bounce back and forth, which creates echoes and other disturbing background issues. We avoided that almost completely by having a non-parallel surface, so that's the decking that you're referring to, right? The nail laminated decking is fluted, so acoustically speaking, it's a diffusive surface. It's also not nearly as hard as gypsum board or concrete or steel, and so it does have some absorptive properties, but they're very small. But that alone makes a big difference. And then we worked with the acoustician on our team, and she helped us identify wall areas where she said, okay, you got a lot of glass in this room. You probably want to put acoustic panels between the glass. And so the classrooms and the teaching labs, for example, have acoustic panels. That auditorium, all of the, Sean, if you scroll down a little bit, that auditorium, all of the blue and white patterning on the wall, those are all acoustic absorbent materials. And then in the atrium lobby space, we kind of thought, well, a little bit of liveliness is not a bad thing, but the space is so open, and students treat the building with a level of reverence that's usually deferred to for a library. It's kind of interesting. And so it is not loud in there. It's really interesting.
And I do want to just take this opportunity to point you to the website. Under resources, you're going to find things like acoustics, and you're going to find our product list for Red List. You will find the Bullet Center's product list. This is all designed to help other projects just know where to start. And we want to help. Going back to what Joshua said, the mission of the building is to serve as a change agent. Think of us as an open source for information.
Ask it, yeah.
First of all, thank you to the design team for coming out here. This is a great project. It's great for the land community itself, so thank you for that. You mentioned the mission. What's the future? This is a non-technical question. What are you excited about moving forward with Georgia Tech students, the community at large, and those that might be?
I volunteered for a class called Vertical Integrated Projects by Jenny Hirsch, who is Georgia Tech Server Sustain since we built the project. And I really enjoyed taking the students on a tour, and then through the semester, they actually throw a lot of stones at the project. they're like, this is how it could be better, and like, wow, this is great, but man, da-da-da-da-da. So I mean, I sometimes I think the best future is to say, okay, how can we do better now? And they love the building and they use it all the time, but it's also really amazing for them to say, well, if we did this, we could be improving equity, or if we do this, it could improve, well, whatever. And so I don't know. I think to me, the future is that generation of students that are going to use it and say, we can do better too, or just do it in general. And it's commonplace for them now because they've lived it.
So a lot of this was, my philosophy was if you build it, it will come. But they built it, and I do a lot of my responsibility to get the good word out through social media, through this type of stuff. And what I have found this year, 2022, is that there are some major projects in the Southeast that have come to the Kenda building multiple times.
would say the one thing I would say in response to that question, the Kenda building is arguably the highest performing building in the southeast, maybe in the country right now.
Maybe the world.
Maybe the world. I don't know. I don't want to get cocky. Part of our goal is to make sure that that does not stand for very long at all. And of course, to be affiliated with a project that knocks it off the throne, right? But that's.
Someone asked me very early in my tenure as like the chief cheerleader, what is success? And I said, my success for me is that the Kenda building is only the face of living buildings for 5 years max. Because the Bullitt Center was the face for like 10 years. And success for me is that when a living building comes online, and this is a nod to Lee. Lee Platinum used to be, oh my God, a Lee Platinum building came online. Now, in many markets, that's expected. I want this type of regenerative building to be the expectation to where it's not a precedent. And Jimmy, do you want to just respond?
No, are we out of time? We did lots of stuff. So on one hand, the challenge is you have to buy offsets. Lots of design elements incorporated that from the beginning. And so, but fundamentally, you know, the mass timber structure would have been the biggest one element that would have reduced embodied carbon. In addition to that, we even studied things like when we picked our mix designs for the concrete, we statistically picked mixes that used on average on the low end of the kilograms of CO2 per cubic yard. So we were just smart about it wherever we could be smart about it. And then since then, we've done a number of studies. We've looked at the data set of those products that were available and how we did, and we kind of published that. But in addition to that, I worked with Michigan State. We worked with Michigan State to analyze the 28 salvage materials, and we analyzed the amount of embodied carbon it would have taken to do what we did with the salvage materials versus the new, and they ended up coming up that for every pound of salvage that we incorporated from local salvage, we avoided 1.5 pounds of CO2. So we've done a lot of work in terms of just to accomplish the goal of the challenge, but then also to provide studies and case studies for others to build on.
I would also say on the embodied carbon front, if you want to stick around for part 2, which I guess is supposed to start like a minute ago in the next room, I think one of the lessons learned actually to me is the way we dealt with embodied carbon on this project. We kind of hit the top of the waves and thought, okay, we're good. And I think in hindsight, we would not do that again. But keep in mind, we started design on this project in 2015. So embodied carbon analysis tools like Tally and OneClick didn't exist. Tally was nascent. It didn't have a Revit interface. So a lot has happened in the last 6 or 7 years to advance that too. So.
No, we're fortunate in Atlanta that we have, at the time, Thomas Concrete was providing environmental product declarations, and today in Atlanta we have 3. So that really is the blocking and tackling of embodied carbon with concrete, is making sure you have multiple suppliers in your area that provides environmental product declarations.
I think you've been waiting super patiently, yeah.
This was a 5-year project?
So we started design in late 2015. We actually weren't hired till like March of 2016 because we did a design competition to get selected for the first like 3 or 4 months. The project was substantially complete in October of 2019. Yeah. So 4 years, not 3.5 years.
Okay, as a builder, I can't wait that long.
It was
Before I get there. How do I take all that you've done and collapse it into what ought to be a sustainable, economical model?
So that was the entire design and construction run. So construction was
The construction was
16 months,
was
or
under
18
it was
months.
under 18 months.
Yeah.
The construction was.
So it wasn't as bad as it sounds. That being said, you're right. We all need to figure out how to accelerate this. I don't have an answer to that question yet.
I gotta say though, if the thing burned down, we had to build it again, it would go a lot faster.
Why does this one have to burn down?
It's just every building's unique, and as soon as you're done with it, you're like, gosh, if we did this again, it would go so much faster.
On that note, can we give everybody a round of applause?